Hello, this is Sam Bismuth, and this is my morning message, and that is that economic liberalism is dead. Now, what the new global status quo is that we have a global market, right? There's a global market, but it's not a free market. Now, in the sense that you treat a country, a state, an economy as a sort of black box, which has inputs and outputs, that kind of thing. Yes, there's a global market. Sure, sure. But in order for a country to really have sovereignty, it has to have the ability to limit its imports and exports. And that is not a free market. If a country has less developed industry in a certain sector, it has to regulate imports in that sector if it wants to develop that industry, because otherwise its domestic industry will be outcompeted by the existing global industry. If a country has natural resources and it sells those resources at a low price instead of extracting benefits for themselves, they are going to be unable to enrich themselves on a national basis. So they use state ownership of natural resources and state-owned companies to prevent that from happening so that they can develop themselves. And even America, now that we are a lesser industrial power than China, we have to rely on non-free global markets, right? We're the enforcers of the non-free global market under the name of the free market, which is funny and completely wrong, in order to maintain the American unipolar system, which is collapsing. Now, many people, libertarians, but also is sort of a common sense viewpoint, they see, well, America, we used to have all this industry, we used to have more free competition, we used to have effective antitrust laws, the banksters weren't in control, all this stuff, sure. Or that the banksters have always been in control to a good extent, but not to the same extent that they currently do, where the state basically prints as much money for them as they want. And the big companies get what's called secondary lending from the Federal Reserve as well. So it's not just banks that get Federal Reserve money, it's also big companies, but it's neither here nor there. There was a time when things were better for us, when things were looking up for us, and we think we can just go back. We can just go back to that time. Well, there's flaws with this idea, right? And one of the major flaws is that the development in the forces of production, specifically technology, right? Maybe not the massive industrial production has increased in America, but the technology of production has increased to such a point where capitalists can't, in a free market with free competition, they cannot actually succeed in making a substantial profit. Because, think about this, right? And this is Marx's insight. The output of a company cannot be sold at above its worth without a monopoly, because then you would have competition and another company would sell under that price. So in a free market, you cannot sell something at above its price. And secondly, you cannot buy commodities and means of production that go into creating goods at below their value. That's not possible. You are going to buy them at the price, right? You're going to buy them at price. So the only point at which a company in a free market, in an economically liberal system, can get profit is by underpaying their workers. But what happens when our technology advances so much that we don't even need that many workers, right? We already see it. People in these modern factories, there's much less of them, and their labor is very, very, very highly exploited. If they got all they were paid, if they were paid the entire extent of the value that they make, they would be very, very rich. And so instead of relying simply on the exploitation of labor, which is still a very important factor in maintaining our economy, the capitalist system, right? Instead, there is a much greater reliance on monopolies, because with a monopoly, you cannot compete with other companies. Think about how our drug prices in America are so high. Why is that? Well, think about, you can't buy drugs from another country. It's not legal. There's no competition allowed. It's not allowed. Right? And that is based on, safety. But it is not allowed. And this type of system, right, which is a monopoly system, is the result of the natural process of capitalism, right? And the reason why these monopolies develop in such a way is because under capitalism, it's not just a free market, right? Or even just a market. That's not what capitalism is. Capitalism is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And the biggest bourgeoisie, the monopolists and bankers, they are the ones that dictate the actions of the state. And you know this. Popular policies, they don't just get implemented just because they're popular. Even pro-industrial policies don't get implemented just because they're pro-industrial. People don't get what they want. Things aren't easy for the average American. No. And the reason is because capitalism is fundamentally bourgeois dictatorship, which inevitably rots into either a monopoly capitalist system or it turns into communism. Those are your choices. That is the inevitable historical and irreversible progress of capitalism. And if you're like a libertarian watching this, or somebody who doesn't understand why we couldn't go back, well, if we did want to go back to having more of a freer system, you would need to make sure that the bourgeois dictatorship doesn't turn it into a monopoly system again. Who's going to make sure of that? Because the people don't have power in a capitalist system. The workers have power in their ability to strike, right? Things like that. Or in their ability to rise up and create a new system in a revolution. The workers have a lot of power. They're the majority. But the workers in a capitalist system don't have the power to say, hey, you can't form a monopoly. We don't have that power. And if you have a theoretical system where there's capitalism, it's totally free capitalism, but somehow, magically, there is a people's force that prevents the bourgeoisie from turning it into monopoly capitalism, you've got socialism. That's socialism. That's communism. Because ultimately, the limits that are placed on capital can only be placed there by some kind of a workers' dictatorship as an alternative to a bourgeois dictatorship. So as participants in an international system where all national sovereignty is based on socialism and anti-free marketism, you have a choice. You can either have monopoly capitalism which itself socializes the economy in many ways towards these monopolies, or you can have socialism or communism. So make your choice, because you can't go back to economic liberalism. That's not an option. That is not an option. And if you do want to go back to what made America great, you're going to need socialism. You're going to need something to dictate the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. A higher level of power, rooted in the people, that cannot be corrupted. And that is socialism. So make your choice, because I think I see where America's headed right now. Right now, history doesn't go in a linear path, but if things go as they go now, in a linear path, what's going to happen is that our economy will be bankrupt, and the only companies, the only entities that are allowed to remain are ones that have the favor of the state, and all of the others will be liquidated. Businesses are disappearing left and right. Banks are getting bailed out more and more and more. And we are on the path between total economic destruction and a hyperinflationary blowout, which relies on extensive stimulus and social programs to dampen the effects. So let's be realistic here. If you want America to be great again, you have to be a socialist. Don't be like those peasants that thought that they could go back to feudalism. We cannot go back to capitalism. It's not happening. And if you want us to go back to capitalism in the good ways, you're a socialist. Thank you, and I'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.